Welcome to the Tom Woods Show, episode 353. Today we're going to talk about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to Congress the other day. And joining us to do that is Daniel McAdams, who is Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, which you can visit at ronpaulinstitute.org. Of course, we'll be linking to that and to everything we talk about today on the show notes page for this episode, which is tomwoods.com/353. All right, let's turn things over now to my conversation with Daniel McAdams. Daniel McAdams, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
It seemed pretty important to talk about this Benjamin Netanyahu speech before Congress today, since that's on everybody's minds, and it is of great importance for a great many reasons. Before we get into the content of the speech, tell us something about the circumstances in which this speech took place, the backdrop, the political backdrop. He was not invited to speak to the Congress by the U.S. president. What exactly happened?
Well, it was John Boehner, the Speaker of the House, who invited Netanyahu to address the House of Representatives. Incidentally, he is the only leader besides the great Winston Churchill, who's addressed Congress 3 times. So that's quite interesting. But yes, apparently Boehner, in collusion with the Israeli ambassador here in the U.S., decided to get Netanyahu over to speak. And as you point out, it was without the participation or even knowledge, I think, initially of the President of the United States. So it's very, very significant in that respect.
And highly unusual, and to the point where even a great many traditional friends of Israel thought this is just a bridge too far.
I think absolutely, and people were embarrassed by it. People were uncomfortable about the way this was done. It was, I can't remember anything like this, Tom, in all my time of studying history, and you're the historian here, but I don't know that something like this has ever happened where the House of Representatives has invited a foreign leader to come over and undermine the policy of the president. You know, that there are constitutional means by which the Congress can express its disapproval of a president's foreign policy. As you know, you can withhold funds, you can provide strong guidance points. There are many things that you can do, but inviting a foreign leader to undermine your stated foreign policy is really something I would guess is unprecedented.
I remember in the old days, Joe Sobran was accused of being cuckoo about and obsessed with Israel, as indeed a lot of people who favor non-intervention are.
Yeah.
But it wasn't that he just had this arbitrary desire to go after one particular country. It's just that this is the only country where shenanigans like this seem to take place in the U.S. This is the only country that gets, in terms of foreign aid, and gets a lot of times what it wants in terms of foreign policy decisions by the U.S. government. I don't see the Sudanese or the South Africans or the Liechtensteinians getting things like this. So that's why it's not that people are they try to make this out to be, well, you must just hate Jewish people. So before we go on, I want to hit this dead on because this is just so stupid. This is the typical right-wing version of racism, because right-wingers are sick of being called racists. So now here's their club. We'll call you an anti-Semite, which is, equally preposterous. And as with most claims of racism, 99 out of 100 of which are just politically motivated smears, it's meant to shut down conversation. And I wonder if you saw this article in the American Conservative just a few days ago by John Basil Utley. Did you see that?
I did. As a matter of fact, I was just looking at it again before we started talking.
Yeah. I actually want to share a couple of passages from this, and I'll link to it on the show notes page. Today is episode 353, so it'll be tomwoods.com/353. Let me just read you this, because this really undermines the view that if you have a particular opinion about the foreign policy that Israel advocates for the U.S., you must hate Jewish people. It's going to be a little bit trickier to make that bizarre claim stick. He says, the Israeli lobby represents less than half of American Jews. The real lobby today is an amalgam of mainly older Jews, evangelical Armageddon believers, and the military-industrial complex, which prospers from unending wars and chaos in the Middle East. A recent Pew poll shows 31% of Jews do not feel attached to the State of Israel, while another 39% feel only somewhat attached. A massive 83% think that construction of settlements on Palestinian lands on the West Bank do not help Israeli security. 62% believe that the Israeli government is not negotiating in good faith with the Palestinians. Then he goes on to talk about J Street, which is the pro-peace Jewish organization in Washington, D.C. And then he goes on to say, even among evangelicals, Daniel, he says, only 30%, because of the aging of the demographic, only 30% of evangelicals sympathize with Israel, while 49% sympathize with Israelis and Palestinians equally. So it's not that they won't try to smear people and destroy their careers, because I've found that that is not something they bat an eye at, but it is going to be very tricky to make that stick in the future.
Absolutely. And, as you started out saying, it's very interesting because you're right. There probably is not another country that has the ability to so strongly influence U.S. foreign policy. And then, as you point out, criticism then is taken as being anti-Semitic. But, just looking at what we do at the Institute, if you remember, it was France that was really hot and heavy about intervening in Libya. And we published, and I've written, and we've spoken numerous things about how horrible the French government was for doing this, how horrible France was. And there's really no, you're Francophobic.
Right. You must hate French people.
And I regularly, because I have a kind of a beef with Saudi Arabia, because I think they push us into a lot of unnecessary conflict, especially in places like Syria. I've written tons of things against them. As a matter of fact, I was just on a program with Dr. Paul the other day, our Liberty Report, and we were both talking about the horrible practices of Saudi Arabia and its toxic relationship with the U.S. No one screams that we're Saudi-phobic and we must therefore be silenced, from society. So it is interesting, and I think the people who are afraid of debate are the ones who would like to retreat into the use of these kinds of language to stifle the debate, to not talk about these figures that you point out that are very, very important. That the lobby is losing people left and right, and the tone is changing.
I want to talk again before we get into the speech itself about a couple of positions that Netanyahu took in the past. That, in fact, before I do that, let me tell you about. I had a guy named Michael McDonald on the show, who has a book on the whole Iraq war, the decision to go to war. And even though he is not a conservative, when we talked about the neocons, he said there is no political thinker more alien to the neocons than Edmund Burke. And I thought, wow, that is so quotable because, of course, could you imagine what Edmund Burke would think about the plan to democratize the Middle East? This would be utterly preposterous to him. Whereas for the neocons, you're a racist if you don't want to democratize the Middle East. Well, anyway, Netanyahu was all in favor of that. If we democratize the Middle East, we'll have this wonderful wave of pro-Western sentiment. What actually has been the result?
I was just looking up that quote again, and it was such a great quote. It was from the beginning of 2003, as the U.S. was in the final stages of what passed for a debate on whether to attack Iraq. And Netanyahu said, if you take out Saddam's regime, I guarantee you it will have enormous positive reverberations on the region.
Yeah.
So talk about it.
The same reverberations he's now here terrified telling us about.
Yes, the reverberations were Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the U.S. going back in to Iraq and now bombing Syria. If anything, as the neocons always are, completely misreading foreign policy, completely wrong. And when shown to be wrong, just simply ignores any of the facts. It's because we didn't do enough or we didn't do it right. He sounds just like McCain.
Of course, and of course he complains about that Baghdad now is in the hands of bad people. Well, you think that might have had a teensy-weensy bit to do with the fact that you get rid of the Sunni regime and then you put in a pro-Shia regime, and that might be more friendly with Iran? It's like we can't think more than 10 minutes ahead with each policy. To say 10 minutes ahead, and 2 or 3 slogans is all we need. So, in other words, there is reason to be skeptical of somebody who basically repeated the most ridiculous, preposterous, obviously exploded theses about the likelihood of Western-style Enlightenment thinking spreading throughout the Middle East. I'm going to listen to a person like this with a grain of salt. All right, let's go through what you consider to be the highlights of the speech, or I don't know how you want to put it. But it is interesting. Let's just start off with the history of Iran that's given, that all of a sudden in 1979 religious fanatics took over, and that's sort of the beginning of the modern history of Iran. It just begins in 1979, but there's no 1953 in this history of Iran.
Absolutely. This evil Iran emerged from nowhere. There was no precedent. There was no intervention. Intervention was never the cause. It's a rewriting of history. But what struck me most about the speech when I was reading it, it really felt like deja vu in 2002 all over again, when the neocons were arguing for war with Iraq. And it was kind of interesting. Of all places, even the Washington Post, I was reading after I was thinking this to myself, even the Washington Post pointed out that when Netanyahu was arguing that Iran and ISIS are two heads of the same beast, is what the writer said. He said it began to sound awfully familiar, like George Bush arguing that Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein must be working together. And sadly enough, Tom, there's still a majority of Americans who believe that Saddam Hussein had a hand in 9/11. So this kind of propagandistic lies is very effective. What most Americans don't probably realize right now is that Iran is actively fighting ISIS in Iraq. And as we speak, so they're actually fighting ISIS. And I wrote a little piece yesterday about McCain, because McCain tweeted how upset he was that Iran was fighting ISIS. And I said, yeah, he'd much rather have American blood being spilled there than having people in the region take care of a problem that they've identified.
I was telling you before we went on that it looks like over the years I added to my Facebook account a lot of people as friends rather indiscriminately, and that's coming back to bite me, because I look at my feed and it's full of, crazy people. And the problem is that I make the mistake of commenting on their threads, which means that according to Facebook's algorithm, I want to see more from these people. So my feed gets worse and worse and crazier and crazier. I just hope they drop me, some of these people, at some point, because I'm too lazy to drop them. But just this morning, I had somebody saying that someday soon, ISIS and Iran will join together for the sake of Islam. And I thought, how could you be more ignorant of the most significant split in the history of Islam to think that that's just a small thing that they can overcome because of their mutual desire to destroy the West? That is not really how it has worked.
But I'm sure that person probably saw it on either Fox News or MSNBC, which are two sides of the same coin. And this is the kind of propaganda that's spewed out to Americans who rely on the mainstream media, spewed out constantly. And it's funny, our leaders talk about how wonderfully diverse our press and our media is, but it's just simply not the case. I know that you spend a lot of time looking at alternative sources, and I certainly do. And it's just like we're living in two different worlds. And when you always know when you start a conversation with someone who relies exclusively on the mainstream media, because it really feels like you're talking to someone from another planet.
I want to exactly. I want to make sure and link to that Weiss annotated version of the speech so that people can get some of the specific replies to some of the specific claims about this official said this and this one said that. Sometimes they didn't actually say these things, or these are made-up quotations or whatever. And it's not, by the way, it's not to say that I would want to live in Iran or that this is a regime that I would ever support. I don't really support any regime anywhere in the world, so that more or less goes without saying. But nevertheless, there's no need to invent things or to be propagandistic or to smear people or just to promote scaremongering, which is what a lot of this is. But what about the claim, though, that we can't, this is a uniquely undeterrable regime. We can't allow them to get nuclear weapons because they can't be deterred. They'll just go and kill all the Jewish people, and they can't be deterred from this. There are two arguments in here. One is that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapon, which they're on the verge of getting one, is something that Netanyahu's been claiming for 20 years or more. They're 3 weeks away or whatever, and this, it's 20 years has gone by, and they're still 3 weeks away. It reminds me of that movie, The Money Pit. The house is going to be ready in 2 weeks, and 4 months later goes on. But I mean, that's not impossible that they could build one, but they're not deterrable. They're unlike all the other enemies we've faced in the past. How do you respond to that? Because there is a superficial plausibility to that.
Well, he has to make that claim, but this is the kind of argumentation that the neocons always do. They will tell you, as Rumsfeld would say, unknown unknowns. They will tell you the most outrageous thing, and certainly it is possible that they are insane. We haven't seen any demonstration of that. As a matter of fact, they seem to be relatively rational actors in the region when you consider the behavior of other countries in the region. But you're right, you as you point out, I think it was in 1992 that Netanyahu first said that Iran is 5 years away from a nuclear weapon. And, we all remember in 2012 when he went down to the UN and he held up that goofy bomb and said that their weapon is 70% complete. Well, I don't know, you probably saw this, Tom, but recently we discovered that leaked cables from October 2012 reveal that even the Mossad believed that Netanyahu was full of beans when he made that claim. There's no evidence for this. His own intelligence services were saying. So what that means clearly is that he's lying. And he also lied when he said Iran is gobbling up countries. And that's like you said about being undeterrable. It's a terrifying thing. It's gobbling up countries. We've got to stop it now before it gobbles up Mexico, Well, but there's just no evidence. Iran hasn't invaded a country since the 1700s.
And yet, toward the end, after he's painted this horrifying picture, toward the end he refers to it as, quote, a very vulnerable regime. Well, which is it? This unstoppable colossus that's gobbling up nations, or a very vulnerable regime? The fact that it is a vulnerable regime is precisely a point on our side. That there are people who favor, westernization of one form or another, and whose cause is completely discredited when the Westerners themselves are constantly beating the war drums against Iran.
It's interesting. I was just watching on Twitter yesterday, which is where I like to read people's comments when things are happening of importance. And I think it was a progressive Jewish person. I don't remember exactly who tweeted it, but someone tweeted a list of all the synagogues just in Tehran. And I think it was 15 or so active synagogues. Try that in Saudi Arabia, our great ally. Try setting up a synagogue there and see what happens. Try having a Bible and talking about Christianity in Saudi Arabia and see what happens. Like you, Tom, I'm not enthusiastic about moving to a place like Iran because there's I don't share the religion and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, the propaganda that's being said about Iran is just incredible. It's just unbelievable.
I was listening to a discussion by Bruce Fein, formerly of the Reagan administration, and who has been fairly high profile in the years since, discussing this. And he said that he just sees no evidence for this claim about Iran. He says, take the Iran-Iraq war. He said they did not go on fighting forever so that they could have their X number of virgins and all that stuff. He said that they didn't. They had a negotiated settlement, and that was it. Even though Saddam was using chemical weapons against them, they did not respond in kind because it was their view that it would not be morally acceptable to do so. And then the U.S. actually shot down an Iranian civilian airliner in 1988 as the war was winding down. And the Iranians did not say, well, now it's all-out war. They just said, look, we need some kind of compensation. And that was the end of it. So, I mean, they don't act the way they're supposed to be acting if they can't be deterred and they're just completely insane.
If they're insane, exactly. That's true. What was interesting is I noticed a lot of even the neocons who were tweeting yesterday about the speech, they seem to have sort of a level of discomfort as well. I think people like Daniel Pletka and others were saying, whatever you think about Netanyahu, love him or hate him, he makes some very good points. So it's clear that they're also somewhat uncomfortable with this whole charade. And I think it's certainly the implications are strong for the election coming up in Israel, and I think Netanyahu is trying to boost his electoral chances back in Israel, and I think he wanted to come here and show how close he was with the U.S. Congress. And that's understandable. I try to give the guy the benefit of the doubt because it's understandable that he would like to have the U.S. help fight his battles for him. Who wouldn't want to have someone assume some risk for you? But at the same time, he makes the point toward the end, which I think is a very interesting point. And I hope he's right. He says, the days when Jewish people remain passive in the face of genocidal enemies is over. We're no longer scattered among the nations. For the first time in 100 generations, we, the Jewish people, can defend ourselves. That sounds great. That's fantastic. And I'm glad they can. Then I hope we can stop sending, however many billions of dollars a year that we send over there and stop being dragged into their regional conflicts. That would be perfect. That would be the logical conclusion to what he claimed.
Daniel, take a minute here at the end of our discussion to say something about this new Ron Paul Liberty report that you're doing with Dr. Paul.
Well, it's sort of the epitome of soft launches, I guess, because we're just sort of working around trying to figure out what might be the best format, and we are releasing some of our early things, and that's why we certainly value the input from all of our friends. We're trying to make something interesting. Dr. Paul obviously is ravenously devours the news. He knows about everything from finance to foreign policy, and he has very important opinions and perspectives on this. And so now that I'm down here in Lake Jackson, Texas, close to Dr. Paul, we're just kind of sitting down in Dr. Paul's studio and trying to go over a few of the issues, and hopefully we're going to develop it into a show, more or less regular television program. So it's exciting. Dr. Paul is. And these will be freely available on YouTube, so there's no subscription or there's no none of the other things that had happened in the past. So this is a whole new thing. It's a very, very soft launch, but we're in the process of building a website and of making it more a sort of a permanent thing for Dr. Paul.
Well, it's great so far. What's the name of the YouTube channel that it's hosted on?
Right now, in our very, very soft launch, this is not even our beta. It's being hosted by the Ron Paul Institute's YouTube page. There eventually will be a Ron Paul Liberty Report YouTube page, but that is not up and running yet. So we're tiptoeing into the waters.
Okay, all right. Well, after we finish talking, I'll ask you where and to what I should link on the show notes page for the Liberty Report. But thanks for a brief conversation with us today about yesterday's speech. We'll put articles that were mentioned today on the show notes page, tomwoods.com/353, and of course a link to the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, which is ronpaulinstitute.org. Daniel, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Tom.
All right, everybody, check out tomwoods.com/353 for links relevant to our discussion today. Remember, of course, I release a new episode every weekday, so Monday through Friday you can get your commute-sized portion of Liberty education. Tomorrow we're going to be talking to Frank Karsten again. You remember our friend from the Netherlands. Frank Karsten, author of Beyond Democracy, co-author of that book. We had a very, very interesting conversation about democracy last time, but he's going to try to make the case for libertarian optimism, and I'm going to throw some objections at him, and it should be a lot of fun, so don't miss that. Of course, if you enjoy this show, you will enjoy my new book, which is called Real Dissent, A Libertarian Sets Fire to the Index Card of Allowable Opinion. Get more details about it at realdissent.com. And you can get the audiobook version with me reading it for free via the offer available through tomwoodsaudio.com. Of course, supporters of the show get the Kindle edition of that book as one of the many perks they get as supporting listeners. So check that out at supportinglisteners.com if you enjoy this show. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. Tomorrow, it's the case for optimism. Let's see if Frank Karsten can persuade you to be optimistic about the future. Join us then. Thanks for listening.
The Tom Woods Show.